Early morning light, still pale and uncertain, fell across a deserted alley on the outskirts of Marseille. The city was slow to awaken. Most people were still lost in sleep behind closed shutters. In that lonely hour, the sharp, insistent cry of a newborn resonated down the narrow passage. For a few moments, there was no one around to notice the sound, no one to be alarmed or even curious. But fate had it that a young courier named Christophe, who was finishing his shift earlier than usual, happened to pass that very spot. He intended to take a shortcut through the side streets, hoping to save a few minutes on his way home. As Christophe walked, he heard something that did not align with any typical morning noise. Initially, he couldn't tell whether it was a distressed animal or maybe a squeaking door. But the closer he came, the clearer the sound became. It was a cry, high-pitched, vulnerable, and heart-wrenching in its urgency. He followed it almost on instinct, turning his steps toward a row of large trash bins near a rundown apartment building. The bins were old, dented, and covered with peeling paint. A broken umbrella teetered precariously on top of one, threatening to slide off. He approached slowly. Even though he considered himself a fairly composed person, something about that eerie cry caused his pulse to quicken. Fear, curiosity, and compassion all blended into an anxious knot in his chest. He bent down and peered into one of the bins. Inside, amid discarded papers, soggy cardboard, and refuse, he glimpsed the tiny form of an infant wrapped in a damp, frayed blanket. For an instant, his mind refused to register what he was seeing. Then reality struck him with full force, and he felt cold horror grip him. There, in the trash, shivering and wailing, was a newborn baby. Christophe reached in with trembling hands, trying to be as gentle as possible. He carefully lifted the small, vulnerable body. The baby's skin was pale, and the frantic cries suggested hunger, cold, or both. Christophe stood there, heart pounding, mind racing through questions that he could hardly formulate. Who could have done this? Was the mother in danger somewhere, or had she intentionally abandoned her child? Was this baby even going to survive? Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and called an ambulance. While he waited, he pressed the infant close to his chest to share some warmth. The morning chill still lingered in the air, and he feared the baby might slip into deeper hypothermia. Feeling the fragile body against him, hearing the tiny, desperate cries subside into softer whimpers, Christophe realized he was responsible for this child's immediate survival. It was a realization that filled him with both dread and determination. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, its siren piercing the early morning silence. Paramedics jumped out and swiftly took the infant from Christophe's arms, wrapping the child in a warming blanket. They checked vital signs, noted the dangerously low body temperature, and gave Christophe a quick nod of gratitude for his prompt response. The baby was placed carefully on a stretcher and carried into the ambulance, surrounded by professional hands that performed each task with practiced efficiency. One of the medics paused briefly to assure Christophe that, so far, the baby was stable. That single moment of reassurance felt like a fragile lifeline, both for the baby and for Christophe's state of mind. Meanwhile, in a small rented room not far from that alley, a 23-year-old woman named Catherine sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest. The feeble morning light seeped in through threadbare curtains. Her eyes were red from crying, and in her hands she clutched a ragged piece of cloth that she had torn from a blanket, a fragment of the one that had once enveloped her newborn. She was overwhelmed by a swirling mixture of emotions, guilt, despair, and a sense of loss so profound that she hardly knew how to breathe through it. Catherine's life had unraveled over the past year in ways she had never foreseen. She had fallen in love with a man who disappeared the moment she told him about her pregnancy. Having lost both her parents years before, she had no immediate family to lean on. The distant relatives she did have lived abroad and were only vaguely aware of her existence, showing no real interest in her struggles. With money scarce, Catherine had found it nearly impossible to get medical attention or even consistent shelter. She tried reaching out to social services, but the process was daunting, requiring forms, interviews, and a stable address, none of which she felt able to manage in her increasingly desperate situation. As her pregnancy progressed, so did her sense of isolation. Nobody was there to offer emotional support or guidance. She drifted from one temporary housing arrangement to another, scraping by on short-term jobs. Some nights she barely ate. Other nights she cried herself to sleep, consumed by the fear of giving birth alone and having no resources to care for a child. The day of her baby's birth arrived with little warning. She went into labor in a cramped, makeshift room, screaming into the darkness as she battled the pain. No midwife, no doctor, no comforting presence stood by her side. She delivered the child herself in a panic, and the shock was almost more than her exhausted mind and body could handle. Holding her newborn for the first time, she felt a deep love warring with an even deeper terror. How could she possibly care for a baby when she could barely keep herself fed and housed? Where would she find money for diapers, formula, or even a secure roof overhead? In the nights that followed, Catherine's anxiety escalated. The baby's cries echoed in her mind, stretching her ragged nerves to the breaking point. Each time she heard the tiny wail, she flashed on her own helplessness, her utter lack of options. Her postpartum state, combined with her economic despair, created a crushing sense of hopelessness that clouded her judgment. It was as though she were stumbling in a dark tunnel, unable to see any glimmer of light at the other end. Finally, in a moment of feverish desperation, Catherine made a decision that would forever alter her life. She wrapped the baby in the only blanket she had, slipped out under the cover of night, and wandered to a secluded alley. Her thoughts were a chaotic storm. Perhaps someone would find the child and give him a better chance. Perhaps the authorities would take him in and provide care she felt powerless to give. Tears streamed down her face as she stood by the trash bins, cradling her child one last time. She placed him gently inside, covered him as best she could, then turned and ran, too overwhelmed to look back. In those minutes, Catherine's world split into a before and an after. On one side stood the life she had led, burdened by poverty and loneliness. On the other side lay a future in which she had abandoned her baby, casting aside a piece of her own soul. She returned to her rented room and collapsed on the floor. For hours, she remained paralyzed by horror and regret. She wanted to go back, to undo everything, but fear chained her in place. While the ambulance raced toward the hospital, the baby, later named Thomas by compassionate nurses, continued to fight for life. Despite the circumstances of his birth and abandonment, he showed signs of surprising resilience. The medical team, seeing his condition stabilize, felt a collective relief. Yet the question still loomed. Who was his mother, and what drove her to such a drastic act? Christophe, too shaken to simply return home and sleep, followed the ambulance on his scooter and waited anxiously in the hospital corridor. He could scarcely process how his life had changed in less than an hour. One moment he was finishing a routine delivery shift. The next he was cradling an abandoned infant. As he paced the hospital halls, every detail of the encounter replayed in his mind. He decided he would come back often to check on the child, feeling a responsibility he couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't pity alone. Something in the baby's cries had awakened in him a fierce resolve not to let this story end in tragedy. In the following days, local police began their investigation. An officer named Oliver, seasoned in the complexities of human behavior, took the lead. He knocked on doors, asked neighbors if they had seen a pregnant woman or anyone acting suspiciously. Some residents mentioned noticing a distressed young woman with a noticeable belly weeks ago, but few details were available. The glimpses were fleeting. She had asked for help. perhaps for a place to stay, but fear or indifference made people turn her away. These vague descriptions led Oliver on a path of frustrating dead ends. Yet the fragments of information suggested the possibility of a woman named Catherine, who had once lived in a cheap rental a few blocks away. The landlady there recalled a woman vanishing suddenly, leaving rent unpaid. Oliver methodically pieced together these scattered clues. He had dealt with cases of child neglect before, but rarely had he felt such a strong undercurrent of sympathy. Something told him that if he found the mother, he might discover not a heartless criminal, but a soul crushed by desperation. Still, the fact remained that a baby's life had been endangered. A child had been found in a trash bin, and someone would have to be held accountable. The law was clear, even if the story behind it was anything but simple. 2 days after the baby was rescued, Catherine could no longer withstand the weight of her guilt. She slipped out under the cover of darkness once again, this time back to the alley where she had left her child. The place looked unchanged except for the absence of the broken umbrella that had once leaned against the bin. Her hands shook as she neared the containers, and tears fell from her eyes when she saw that her baby was, of course, no longer there. She realized with dreadful finality that she had no way to find him on her own. The cold, unwelcoming alley seemed to mock her with its silence. As she stood there, sobbing softly, a police patrol car turned into the alley. Oliver, behind the wheel, slowed when he spotted a hunched figure near the trash bins. He got out, approached cautiously, and noticed the woman's tear-stained face. When she tried to leave, he gently detained her. The look in her eyes, a mixture of terror and sorrow, told him more than words could. Softly, he asked whether she knew anything about a baby that had been found recently. Her reaction, trembling, gasping for breath, tears flowing, was all the confirmation he needed. His voice softened further as he explained that the baby was alive and receiving care at the hospital. Catherine looked at him with an expression of disbelief, then whispered words of relief and anguish. "He's alive. Thank God." Oliver took her to the police station where she was given a warm cup of tea. She clutched it as if it were the only solid thing in her world. Slowly, haltingly, she recounted her story. The loneliness, the pregnancy without support, the terror of giving birth alone, and the blinding despair that led her to abandon her child. She did not try to justify her actions. She merely laid bare the crushing sense of hopelessness that had driven her to commit something she could hardly believe she had done. Seeing the depth of her remorse and mental anguish, Oliver realized this case was not a simple matter of malicious child endangerment. There were layers of psychological trauma. He called a social worker to evaluate Catherine's condition and determine if she needed immediate medical or psychiatric help. Meanwhile, the official process had to move forward, but Oliver decided to do what he could to ensure that if Catherine truly wanted to make amends, the system would at least hear her out. Throughout this time, Thomas remained in the hospital. Nurses and doctors, touched by the baby's resilience, gave him a cheerful name to celebrate the hope they believed he represented. They monitored him closely, offering round-the-clock care. The child was so small and fragile that many of the staff members found themselves growing attached, despite the usual professional boundaries. They smiled each time he opened his eyes or moved a tiny arm. In a sense, caring for him became a symbol of defiance against despair. Christophe visited daily. He would bring small gifts, soft blankets, the smallest baby clothes he could find, little stuffed animals. He spoke gently to the baby, even though he knew Thomas was too young to understand. The nurses watched with a sense of growing admiration. Here was a man who had no real connection to the child, yet he was determined not to let Thomas feel alone in the world. Some staff members half-jokingly called him the baby's godfather, though no formal arrangement had been made. Catherine, after her confession, found her mind in tumult. She was taken to a place of temporary custody while the social worker assessed her situation. She slept little, haunted by images of leaving her baby in that cold bin. Over and over, she wondered if she could ever be forgiven, or if it was even her right to want forgiveness. The social worker recommended a psychiatric evaluation, suspecting Catherine was suffering from severe postpartum depression on top of her dire socio-economic circumstances. Eventually, a small breakthrough arrived. Under supervision, Catherine was allowed to visit Thomas in the hospital. She stepped into the ward, her legs unsteady beneath her. There, in a tiny crib, lay the baby she had last seen in a desperate midnight haze. Now he was wrapped in a clean blanket, sleeping peacefully under the gentle glow of a warming lamp. Catherine approached with tears brimming in her eyes. Guilt, relief, and an overwhelming love flooded her, conflicting emotions almost too strong to bear. She hesitated to touch him, fearing she might upset him or that she didn't deserve to hold him. One of the nurses hesitated too, wary of letting the mother near the infant she had abandoned. But the social worker intervened, reminding everyone that the law had granted Catherine this supervised visit. Catherine leaned over the crib, tears dropping onto the edge of the blanket. She whispered broken words of apology, though she knew the baby could not possibly understand her. Just then, the door to the ward opened, and Christoph came in, holding a small bag of baby items he had purchased. He stopped short when he saw Catherine. Their eyes locked. An unspeakably tense silence filled the room. Then, quietly, he spoke. "You're the mother?" She nodded, unable to form a coherent sentence. He swallowed hard and said, "He's okay. The doctors say he'll be fine. I'm glad you're here." The moment was fraught with conflicting emotions, anger, empathy, confusion, and a glimmer of hope all tangled together. Catherine sobbed, silently thanking whatever force in the universe had allowed her child to survive. She felt undeserving of this mercy, yet profoundly relieved at the same time. Christophe felt an odd compassion. On one hand, the thought of abandoning a child horrified him. On the other, he could see Catherine was truly broken by her own actions. He couldn't bring himself to condemn her outright, not without understanding the full context of her desperate life. Legally, Catherine faced serious consequences. A court hearing was scheduled to determine whether she should be charged with attempted harm to a minor or if extenuating circumstances, particularly severe postpartum depression, might influence the judgment. Meanwhile, Child Protective Services had to decide Thomas's immediate future. Foster care or adoption loomed as possibilities, given the precarious nature of Catherine's mental health and financial instability. Despite the gravity of the situation, Catherine clung to a faint hope that she could regain custody of her child one day. She knew it would require a monumental effort. She enrolled in counseling sessions where she laid bare her fears and her past. Her counselor noted the profound sadness that enveloped her, combined with an intense will to atone for what she had done. Catherine searched for more stable employment, even looking into short-term vocational courses, hoping to piece together a life that might be safe for a growing child. Christophe followed the developments with quiet dedication. He continued to visit Thomas, building an unspoken bond that no one had expected. He sometimes encountered Catherine in the hospital waiting area or at the social worker's office. Their conversations remained brief and awkward, but gradually the hostility and fear that might have arisen between them softened into mutual concern for Thomas's well-being. Occasionally, they exchanged a few words about the baby's progress. She would thank him for his kindness. He would reassure her that Thomas was growing stronger each day. The staff at the hospital found themselves quietly rooting for some positive outcome. While they knew that reuniting an abandoned child with his mother was fraught with complications, many felt that a strong support system, combined with genuine remorse, might give Catherine and Thomas a chance at rebuilding a life together. Nonetheless, they were realistic. They understood the law had to run its course, and that child services would only permit reunification if it was determined to be in the best interest of the baby. As the court date approached, Catherine spent long days in a tiny room provided by a charity organization. She studied job listings, filled out applications, and attended mandatory meetings with social workers. Nighttime, however, was the hardest. She would lie awake in the dark, plagued by flashbacks of that terrible moment in the alley. The sense of guilt was crushing. Still, she persevered, clinging to the belief that if she showed genuine commitment to change, maybe, just maybe, the judge would consider granting her supervised visitation or a partial custodial arrangement. When she finally appeared before the court, her story came spilling out. She described her childhood, the loss of her parents, the fruitless attempts at seeking help while pregnant, and the crushing weight of having no one to guide her or support her. A mental health professional testified about her diagnosis: severe postpartum depression, exacerbated by her dire living conditions. Oliver, the investigating officer, also spoke, carefully noting that while the act itself was inexcusable, Catherine's cooperation and evident remorse indicated she was neither malicious nor indifferent. There was, Oliver suggested, a strong possibility she could be rehabilitated with the right intervention. The judge considered all angles and concluded that while there had been an egregious lapse in Catherine's responsibility, the context was indeed complex. The legal system did not ignore the seriousness of her actions, but nor was it blind to mitigating factors. Catherine was given a suspended sentence, contingent on her continued participation in therapy, job training, and regular check-ins with social services. As for Thomas, the court required him to remain under protective care until a thorough review could ensure that Catherine was fit to assume her role as a parent. For many mothers, such an arrangement might seem punitive, but to Catherine it felt like a ray of hope. She would remain under close watch, yes, but she now had a path forward, a structured program that, if followed diligently, might lead to a life shared with her son. She began to seize every opportunity: therapy sessions to address her trauma, parenting workshops to learn how to care for an infant, and vocational courses to gain employable skills. During this transitional phase, Thomas was placed in a small nursery run by a local charity. The environment was clean, supportive, and staffed by professionals who understood the complexity of the situation. Christophe visited often, still bringing needed supplies, and sometimes simply sitting quietly beside the baby's crib, reading or humming softly. Nurses noticed that his presence had a calming effect on Thomas. The baby would look up, wide-eyed, seeming to take in the gentle tone of Christophe's voice. In many respects, Christophe had become an unofficial guardian figure. Catherine, too, was permitted supervised visits, albeit on a strict schedule. Each time she held Thomas, she marveled at how he was growing, how his small limbs grew stronger, how his eyes began to focus on the world around him. With every visit, her determination solidified. She wanted to earn back the right to call herself his mother in every sense of the word. Sometimes Christophe would be there, watching from a respectful distance. Neither of them spoke much, but an unspoken understanding passed between them. Both cared deeply for this child, and both had roles to play in ensuring his future. Over the next few months, Catherine's progress was monitored. She made modest strides in rebuilding her life. She secured a part-time job in a small tailoring shop, thanks to the sewing skills she had learned. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work and allowed her to save money and pay down some debts. She found a tiny studio apartment that, while humble, was safe and clean. Social workers visited her regularly to gauge her living conditions and emotional stability. The final decision about custody lay in the hands of a family court, which would evaluate reports from social services, mental health professionals, and Catherine's employer. It was a tense time for everyone involved. Yet even in this uncertainty, a sense of guarded optimism began to surface. Catherine had not lapsed in her responsibilities. She had continued her therapy, remained employed, and upheld every requirement set by the court. For the first time in a long while, she began to believe she had a future worth fighting for. Still, doubts lingered. Could she truly overcome the guilt of nearly ending her baby's life by abandoning him? Would Thomas, when he was old enough to understand, be able to forgive her? These questions weighed on her constantly. She promised herself she would be honest with him someday, if the chance arose, explaining how despair had blinded her to reason. She vowed she would devote every ounce of her strength to ensure he never felt that kind of desperation in his own life. Meanwhile, Christoph, whose initial involvement had been as random as it was fateful, continued to feel a deep sense of compassion. He had never considered himself the paternal type, but the events of those months changed his perspective on life. He became an advocate, albeit informally, for abandoned and neglected children. Sometimes he would even volunteer at the nursery, helping out for a few hours between shifts. In private moments, he wrestled with how best to relate to Catherine. Part of him still felt anger at what she had done, but seeing her genuine efforts toward rehabilitation softened his judgment. He began to recognize the tragedy that can befall someone who feels utterly alone in the world. At last, the day came when the family court convened to decide whether Catherine could have partial custody of Thomas, or if he would remain a ward of the state until a foster or adoptive family could be found. The hearing was solemn, but Catherine presented evidence of her steady employment, her counseling records, and the strong endorsements from social workers and mental health professionals who attested to her progress. In the end, the court granted Catherine a carefully supervised reintegration plan, starting with regular weekend visits in her new apartment, escalating to full-time custody if all went well over a period of several months. Tears streamed down her face when she heard the judge's words. The weight of relief was almost overwhelming. She knew the road ahead would still be challenging. She would have to maintain her stability, follow all guidelines, and continue therapy. But for the first time, she felt she was stepping onto solid ground, holding on to a hope that her child might know her, not as the mother who abandoned him, but as the mother who fought with every breath to earn him back. This entire saga serves as a reminder of how complicated human lives can be. A single moment of despair can lead to an act that most would label unforgivable, yet beneath the horror may lie layers of tragic circumstances and profound psychological distress. For Catherine, this story became a crucible, testing her moral fiber and resilience. For Thomas, it marked the beginning of a life overshadowed by a dark chapter that he would one day learn about. For Christoph, it was a call to compassion and involvement he could never have anticipated. And for Oliver, the police officer, it reinforced a lesson he had learned over many years of service. Nothing is simple, and empathy is sometimes as vital as justice. No one can say for certain how this story will ultimately conclude. Catherine and Thomas still face an uphill journey. Societal judgment can be harsh, and psychological wounds do not vanish overnight. But there is a profound possibility that, through continued support, therapy, and unwavering determination, both mother and child can heal and forge a new path forward. If this story has resonated with you, consider subscribing to my channel so you won't miss future stories. We will continue to explore challenging life situations, the inner struggles of individuals, and how the line between a desperate act and a plea for help can sometimes be unbearably thin. May this narrative serve as a testament to the transformative power of empathy, the complexities of human frailty, and the enduring possibility of redemption, even in the darkest moments.